It was the fall of 1934, right in the middle of the Great Depression, when 30 construction workers were hired to dig the foundation for what was supposed to be a new state office building. These men weren't just workers. They were fathers, husbands, veterans from the Great War, and desperate breadwinners who'd take any job that put food on the table. The project site was a muddy field on the edge of town, the kind of place where wind whistled through half-dead trees and the ground always seemed colder than it should have been. But to them, the job meant survival. Each morning before sunrise, the crew gathered at the site with their shovels, picks, and heavy machinery. They were paid pennies on the dollar, but nobody complained. Not when hunger gnawed at home. Neighbors remembered the workers whistling old tunes as they carried their lunch pails through the fog, boots caked with dirt before the day even began. Yet there was something strange about the project from the very start. There were no signs, no public announcements, and no one in town seemed to know exactly what the building was meant for. On October 17th, the day everything changed, the men arrived as usual. By mid-morning, witnesses recalled the steady clang of steel on rock echoing across the valley. Horses tethered near the site shifted nervously, refusing to stay close. Around noon, the noise stopped. At first, people assumed it was just the workers breaking for lunch. But when no one came back into town that evening, when the job site lay quiet, tools scattered across the ground like dropped toys, folks began to worry. A local foreman was the first to investigate. What he found sent shivers down his spine. Lunchboxes sat neatly against a wall, sandwiches untouched, coffee still warm in tin cups. Pickaxes and shovels were half buried in the dirt as if dropped mid-swing. Wheelbarrows full of gravel stood abandoned in the middle of the trench. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no footprints leading away, just the eerie stillness of a place where 30 men had been working only hours earlier. By nightfall, families gathered at the edge of the site with lanterns, calling out the names of their husbands and sons. Their voices carried over the empty dig pit, swallowed by the wind. Search parties calmed the area for days, but there were no bodies, no clues, not even a scrap of clothing left behind. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed 30 men whole in broad daylight, and the town was left with a silence too heavy to explain. In the weeks that followed, the small town buzzed with confusion and fear. Families demanded answers, but local officials seemed strangely reluctant to investigate too deeply. Newspaper reporters who showed up were met with half smiles and vague statements about tragic accident. But what kind of accident could erase 30 grown men without leaving a single trace? Behind closed doors, people began whispering about something far darker, something the authorities weren't willing to admit. The strangest part was how quickly the state stepped in. Within days, men in dark suits arrived in unmarked cars, sealing off the site and posting guards. No one was allowed near the pit. Families who had come to lay flowers or search for keepsakes were turned away, some even threatened with arrest if they didn't leave. It was as though the government wasn't trying to find the missing men, but rather trying to make the entire event disappear. Rumors spread faster than wildfire. Some townsfolk swore the workers had uncovered something buried deep in the soil, something so important it had to be hidden from the public. Old-timers whispered about native burial grounds, cursed land, or even military experiments gone wrong. Others believed the government had been using the project as a cover for something secret, and the men had seen too much. The more people speculated, the more the silence from the authorities seemed to confirm it. Even the local press grew suspicious. A small regional newspaper tried to run a story titled, "The Shift That Never Came Home." But before it went to print, the entire article was pulled, and the editor released a bland piece about unfortunate worksite hazards. To this day, no one knows if he was pressured, bribed, or threatened. What was clear, however, was that someone, somewhere, did not want the truth coming out. Families who pressed too hard for answers began receiving anonymous letters and phone calls. Widows reported hearing clicks on their phone lines, as if someone was listening in. One mother claimed 2 men in suits came to her door and told her flatly, "For your own good, stop asking questions." The town, once full of chatter, fell into a strange, heavy silence. The disappearance of 30 men was no longer just a tragedy. It had become a secret, guarded by forces far bigger than the people left behind. 65 years after the disappearance, most people had forgotten the story, or at least convinced themselves it was just a strange footnote in the town's history. By 1999, the Depression-era scars were long gone, and suburban sprawl had reached the edges of what was once farmland. That was when a mechanic named Harold Jennings bought a run-down property outside Chicago. The deal was cheap, almost too cheap, and came with an old house and a collapsing garage out back. The realtor brushed it off as junk storage, but Harold, a stubborn man with a taste for fixing things, figured he could salvage it. The garage was different from the rest of the property. The house, though dusty and worn, still felt like a home. But the garage stood apart, its boards warped and blackened by decades of weather. Windows had been nailed shut, and rust streaked down the metal siding like dried blood. The locals didn't talk much about it, but when Harold mentioned plans to restore it, his new neighbors exchanged uneasy glances. One even muttered under his breath, "Best leave that place shut." Harold laughed it off, assuming it was just small-town superstition. For weeks, Harold worked on the house, avoiding the garage. But every time he crossed the yard, he felt the weight of it looming, as though the building itself was watching him. Some nights, he swore he heard faint metallic clatters from inside, like chains dragging across concrete. But when he pressed his ear to the door, there was nothing but silence. His wife refused to go near it. His dog would bark furiously at the entrance, hackles raised, then retreat as though something inside had stared back. It wasn't until a violent storm rolled through one night that Harold finally broke the seal. A lightning strike hit close to the property, sending vibrations through the ground and shaking the garage's frame. One of the boards splintered loose, banging against the siding. Rain poured in torrents and Harold, determined to prevent the whole structure from collapsing, grabbed his crowbar and pried the door open for the first time in decades. The air that escaped was foul and heavy, like a tome exhaling after years underground. Inside, Harold expected dust, cobwebs, and old tools. Instead, he found the space strangely organized, as if someone had locked it up mid-use. Broken machinery lay in piles, tarps covered stacks of crates, and in the far corner, almost hidden under layers of junk, was a warped square of wood in the floor. A trapdoor. The sight of it sent a chill through Harold's bones, though he couldn't say why. Something deep inside him whispered not to open it, not to disturb what had been left undisturbed for so long. But Harold was a curious man, and curiosity was about to drag him into a story that had been buried since 1934. When Harold finally pried open the trapdoor, the wood groaned like something alive. A wave of air rushed up, damp and sour, stinging his nostrils with the smell of rust and rot. It wasn't the musty scent of a basement, but something older, like the ground itself had been sealed for decades, holding on to secrets no one was meant to breathe. He hesitated at first, shining his flashlight into the narrow opening. A concrete stairwell descended into pitch black silence, steps cracked and damp with seepage. For reasons he couldn't explain, Harold's heart hammered in his chest as if his body already knew what his mind didn't. The descent felt endless. Each step echoed hollowly, swallowed by the space below. The walls were poured concrete, rough and uneven, as though hurriedly constructed. Water dripped steadily from unseen cracks, and the air grew colder with every step. When Harold's boots finally met solid ground, he realized he wasn't in a basement at all but a chamber. A room hidden beneath the garage, completely cut off from the world above. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing 4 walls scrawled with markings. At first, Harold thought they were graffiti or perhaps childish etchings scratched into the concrete. But as he moved closer, the truth sank in. Names, dozens of them, some large and bold, others small and trembling, all carved with desperation into the walls. The handwriting was jagged, frantic. As Harold traced the beam of light across the room, he realized every name belonged to one of the 30 men who had vanished in 1934. The chamber wasn't just hidden, it was a grave marker written by the missing themselves. In one corner of the chamber lay a pile of rusted tools, shovels, picks, and crowbars, all worn down, their handles splintered from heavy use. But stranger still, the tools weren't covered in soil. They were coated with deep scratches, gouges as though the men had been hacking at something harder than rock. Across the chamber floor were gouged lines, claw-like streaks leading toward the far wall. Harold followed them with unease, his breath fogging in the cold air. Something about the room felt unfinished, as though whatever the men had uncovered had been hastily walled off again. Then his flashlight caught on something metallic glinting near the far side of the chamber. It wasn't a tool this time, but a stack of objects covered with a thin sheet of rotting cloth. He reached out and pulled the fabric aside, sending a cloud of dust into the air. Beneath it sat a row of old film canisters, their labels worn but still legible enough to read a single word scrawled in black ink: dig. Harold's throat went dry. These weren't just artifacts. They were recordings, evidence left behind by the 30 men who were never supposed to be found. Harold carried the canisters upstairs, his hands trembling. They were heavier than he expected, coated in grime, the metal edges sharp with rust. The labels were faded but still readable, short words like shift, dig, and final. He didn't own much, but tucked away in a back room of the house was an old reel-to-reel projector he'd inherited from his father. It hadn't been used in years, yet something inside him insisted he had to see what was on those reels. Against his better judgment, he cleaned the dust off the machine, loaded the first canister, and dimmed the lights. The projector whirred to life, casting flickering light onto the blank wall. The footage began with shaky black and white images of the workers themselves. They were dressed in worn overalls and heavy boots, their faces smeared with sweat and dirt. At first, the men looked ordinary, laughing and joking as they dug deep into the foundation trench. The camera, likely handled by one of the workers, panned across their camp. Lunch pails, tools, even a makeshift tent. But as the reel went on, the tone shifted. The laughter faded. The men's expressions grew tight, nervous. They were digging into something solid, something their picks struck with a hollow ring instead of a thud. The next reel was darker, both in tone and in picture quality. The camera trembled as though the man holding it was afraid. The workers had uncovered a wall underground, smooth, unnatural, and extending farther than the light could reach. Strange symbols were etched into its surface, markings none of the men recognized. In the footage, a few of them pressed their ears to the wall, whispering that they could hear faint sounds, like something moving on the other side. One worker shouted at the cameraman to stop filming, but the reel continued, capturing every detail until the frame cut abruptly to black. By the time Harold loaded the third reel, his palms were slick with sweat. The footage this time was chaotic. The workers were no longer calm. They were shouting, swinging their tools frantically. The camera caught glimpses of dirt collapsing, lanterns toppling, and shadows darting across the walls. One man screamed as the ground gave way beneath him, vanishing into darkness. Another dropped his pickaxe and bolted toward the surface, only to be pulled back by something unseen. The reel ended with the camera falling sideways, capturing only boots running across the frame before the film burned out. The last reel was the shortest, and it was the one Harold almost wished he hadn't watched. It showed the chamber he had just discovered beneath his garage. Only it was lit by lanterns, filled with the 30 men huddled together, their faces pale with terror. One by one, they scratched their names into the walls, some praying, others weeping. The final image was a man holding the camera himself, staring directly into the lens with hollow eyes. His lips moved as though he were trying to warn whoever might find the footage. But before any words could be heard, the reel snapped, the projector went silent, and the wall in Harold's home was left glowing with the last frozen frame of a man about to vanish into history. Harold didn't have long to process what he'd seen. Within 48 hours of running the reels, strange cars began appearing on his street. Dark sedans with tinted windows, parked too long, engines idling even when no one seemed inside. At first, Harold thought he was being paranoid. But then, late one evening, as he stepped out to smoke on the porch, 2 men in gray suits approached from the shadows. Their voices were calm, practiced, and unnervingly polite. They asked about items of historical interest he might have found on his property. When Harold played dumb, one of the men leaned in close and whispered, "You've already seen too much." The following morning, the quiet cul-de-sac turned into something out of a nightmare. Black vans blocked the road, and a crew of men in plain uniforms began unloading heavy crates and equipment. They moved with precision, speaking little, working quickly. Neighbors peeked through curtains, whispering that Harold must have been hiding stolen goods or explosives. But Harold knew better. They weren't there to accuse him. They were there to erase what he'd uncovered. The garage was sealed off with yellow tape, and guards with blank expressions stood at both entrances. No explanation was given, no paperwork, no warrants. Just authority that dared anyone to challenge it. Inside, the men stripped the chamber bare. Harold wasn't allowed near, but he watched from his upstairs window as the film reels were carried out in padded cases, treated like dangerous material. Even the scratched tools and the etched walls were documented, photographed, then covered over with fresh slabs of concrete. When Harold tried to object, one of the agents simply raised a hand, silencing him without a word. Their movements were clinical, almost rehearsed, as if this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. By the end of the week, the trapdoor was sealed with a steel plate, welded shut, and the garage padlocked with a sign that read, "Condemned. Unsafe for entry." But Harold knew the danger wasn't structural. He could feel it in the way the agents avoided eye contact, in the way they flinched at the sound of the wind howling across the open field. Something about that chamber terrified even them, though they'd never admit it. More unsettling still, the names on the walls, the desperate scratches of 30 vanished men, were scrubbed away, erased as though they had never existed at all. And then came the warning. A plain envelope slid under Harold's door one night, containing only a single photograph. It was the final frame from the last reel, the man staring into the camera with hollow eyes. Scrawled across the back in red ink were the words, "Do not speak of this again." Harold's hands shook as he read it. The government hadn't just taken the reels. They had eyes on him, on his every move, making sure the secret of the 30 vanished workers stayed buried for good. Years later, the garage still stands at the edge of Harold's property, padlocked and chained, with warning signs plastered across its doors. Locals walk past it without speaking, as though acknowledging it might somehow draw attention to themselves. Children dare each other to peek through the cracks, but no one lingers long. Neighbors say the place hums at night, a low vibration under the soil, like machinery running deep below the earth. Whether it's the wind or something else, no one has ever been able to prove. The silence around the garage has become its own legend, a ghost story whispered from porch to porch. What unsettles people most is not what was taken from the garage, but what was left behind. No one knows what happened to Harold after the government sealed the site. Some say he moved away, others claim he vanished just like the workers, his house found empty with no trace of departure. Yet there are those who insist he still lives quietly nearby, keeping his head down, carrying secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. His name never appeared in official reports, and to this day, not a single record of him purchasing that property exists. Archivists and amateur historians who've dug into the case find themselves frustrated at every turn. Records of the 1934 construction project are gone, blueprints erased, payrolls missing, government contracts dissolved as though they never existed. Even microfilm copies of newspapers from that month contain blank spaces where articles should have been. It's as if an invisible hand reached back through time and scrubbed clean every piece of evidence that 30 men ever worked, lived, or disappeared there. But the families, what few descendants remain, still swear by their bloodlines that their fathers, grandfathers, and uncles never came home from that job. And then there are the whispers, the chilling ones. Hunters crossing the woods at night have claimed to hear voices beneath the earth. Muffled, desperate cries that vanish when the wind changes. A construction crew digging a new sewer line a mile away reported their equipment shaking violently, though seismologists recorded no quake in the area. One worker quit on the spot, swearing he heard picks striking rock from somewhere underground, long after the shift had ended. The unanswered question still hangs heavy: what exactly did those men uncover in 1934 that cost them their lives, and why was it so dangerous that the government has spent decades trying to bury it? Were the workers victims of a cave-in, or were they silenced for discovering something older, deeper, and far beyond human understanding? The garage remains locked, the chamber sealed, and the truth, whatever it is, lurks just beneath the soil, waiting for the day someone dares to dig again. So maybe the scariest part of this entire mystery isn't the 30 men who vanished without a trace, it's the silence that followed. The erased records. The padlocked garage. The warnings that came too late. 65 years later, the ground is still there, undisturbed, hiding whatever truth those men uncovered. Maybe it was just a collapse, maybe something darker. But one thing's for certain: someone, somewhere, doesn't want us to know. And as long as that garage stays sealed, the questions will never stop. Because when 30 men disappear in broad daylight, and history itself tries to erase them, you have to ask yourself, what's still buried down there? If you liked this video, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Most importantly, subscribe and hit the bell icon so the next secret finds you first.